Hey there, my name is Prakash. I am the co-founder and the co-CEO of Xano. Today, I'm excited to go through a very requested video, which is how you do OAuth with Webflow. And we're going to do that using Xano and Webflow today. But for those of you that don't know what OAuth is, and you're just here because you heard that you can get users to sign in with Facebook or Twitter or pick your service, we're going to review or do a high-level overview starting with what is OAuth, just to give you a primer. We'll take about 5 minutes on that. Then we're going to set up Google OAuth specifically using Xano, and then we will get into the Webflow setup. It's important to note that even though we're going to use Google today, the concepts of what we are going to cover today remain the same for any service you might want to use with OAuth. So let's go ahead and get started and just go through an introduction on what is OAuth. Feel free to skip ahead if you just want to get to the actual setup itself. So getting started, just for those of you that don't know what Xano is, we like to say that we're the fastest way to build a powerful, scalable backend for your app without using any code. So even more basically, every application has a front end and a back end. The front end is what the user sees. The back end is all of the business logic. So we specifically focus on three things at Xano. We give you a scalable managed server, a very flexible database, and finally, a no-code API builder to kind of get everything done and get everything connected, which is awesome. So going into just the concepts of OAuth in general, it's first important to know that APIs in general are the glue of the internet. They are what connects one service to another, or they are what connect your backend really with your front end, right? And so if you think about the most popular services, you'll probably recognize these three things, or these three services. All of them are API driven, or they have APIs that can connect into other services. So for these specifically, Google has the API for their mapping product and also for user photos. Stripe does payments, right? So you don't have to learn how to build a payments infrastructure. You just connect to their API. And then Twilio handles all messaging, whether it be text messages or transactional email. So, services like Airbnb, for example, might leverage these three APIs to get things done, right? So Twilio to send reservation confirmations to their guests, Stripe to basically process the payments, and Google to do the Google Maps. And the way Airbnb specifically communicates with Stripe and Twilio, for example, is via an API key. There's usually some sort of key and secret that basically tells Twilio and Stripe, hey, I'm Airbnb, this is how I want to communicate with you, and there's a handshake that's established there. Google's a little special because, yes, Airbnb has that API key and secret relationship with Airbnb, or they kind of speak to each other in that way. But there's also the ability for Airbnb to access, for example, the user's photos, right? Like, so if I'm a guest or I'm a host and I want to list my apartment and I want to also upload the photos that are stored in my Google account, there has to be a way for Airbnb to get that from my Google account, right? And that's really the crux of what OAuth is. So getting into the nitty-gritty of this example, this is a screen from Airbnb's host workflow or onboarding process where I can upload photos from my Google Drive. You can see that here at the bottom. So this capability actually begs the question, how does one service authorize access to another? So specifically, I'm an Airbnb host, and I want to give Airbnb permission to access just the photos of my apartment that I want to rent out so it can then publish it to its website. Well, there's a couple different ways that this could happen. Airbnb could go to Google directly and say, hey, Google Drive service, that's where the photos are kept, go ahead and give me Prakash's photos from his Google account. Well, that's not going to happen. Google Drive is going to say, look, I don't trust you. There's no way I'm going to give you that access. So alternatively, Airbnb could say hey, why don't you store your Google username and password with us, and then we can access your Google Photos at any time. Now, while this technically could work, us as users, we don't feel comfortable storing our credentials with third-party services, if there's a data breach that's really, really insecure. So we don't want to store our Google username and password with Airbnb. So We say obviously no. So what needs to happen is a mechanism to allow basically a trusted party to give access to both Airbnb and to Google. And this is where OAuth, or open authorization, was introduced, this protocol. So specifically, each service, Airbnb and Google, trusts this user. So what ends up happening is Airbnb now goes to Google, that same example, and Google basically will come to me and say, hey, are you okay with this? Are you okay with Airbnb accessing your photos? Well, I may say like, yes, okay, and the way I do this specifically is usually through one of these dialogues. You've probably seen this before when you're like continuing with Facebook or Google to any one of these services. They say, hey, is it okay that we continue logging you in with Facebook, for example, to a service, and then you select specifically what you want that service to have access to. So if I say allow access, then Google Drive says, okay, I'm going to pass an authorization token to Airbnb using what's called a limited access token. Now, limited access is important because I'm not saying Airbnb can have access to my entire Google universe. I'm just saying that they can have access to specifically the photos I want them to have access to. So Airbnb now has that. They can take this limited access token and then access anytime they want using the credentials that Google has provisioned with my permission to get access to those photos. So I know that might feel a little complex. All you need to know is that there's a third party, trusted party, which is me. I give access to Airbnb through Google, and Google passes that limited access token to Airbnb to use anytime it wants to access my photos. So the final thing just to note is that the standard or protocol which is mostly used today is OAuth 2.0, right? There is an OAuth 1.0 standard and protocol, but it's used far less. So I think that when we talk about OAuth, we usually talk about OAuth 2.0. Okay, so let's go ahead and move into the example where we are setting up a service where people can log in using their Google account. So we're going to create a backend in Xano, and then finally we're going to take that and then move into Webflow. So clicking into Xano, I can see that I am creating a new workspace. And every Xano account, you do this. So I'm just going to call it OAuth Webflow Demo. And I think technically it's capital A. It doesn't matter what you call it. So I'm going to go ahead and start from scratch. I'm going to just have like a simple user database table. I'll go ahead and hit continue. I'm going to hit continue here. So here on the final step, it asks, how will your users log in, right? By default, we allow them to log in with email using JWE tokens. However, we are going to check Google because that's the example that we're doing today. Xano obviously also supports what you're seeing here: Facebook, LinkedIn, Auth0, and Apple, and more are coming down the pipe. So I'm going to click Finish, and then it's going to set up my Xano account. Okay, so it says you have further work to do. You have to actually set this up. The reason you need to set it up is because even though we've done all the hard work for you in kind of linking up your database tables and API endpoints, which we're about to cover, we have to establish the relationship with Google, right? So I'm going to go ahead and click this button, and I'll be taken to the actual extension that I installed in Xano. And then if I hit configure, you'll see that I need to tell Xano about my specific OAuth client ID that I get from Google and the secret that I get from Google. Now, if you follow these detailed instructions, this tells you exactly how to get that. There's also a video walkthrough, but I'm going to just do that very quickly here for you. So I've already selected or started a Google Cloud Platform project. Again, you can go click this link and it'll take you to the same place. I'm just going to call this Webflow Xano OAuth, okay? And I'll go ahead and I'll hit create. Okay, so now that I've created this, the next thing that I need to do is actually go to the OAuth consent screen. So I'm saying with this particular project, I need to create a place where my users can authenticate using that service. So I'm just going to click this link. That's going to take me directly there. And I'm going to go to this OAuth consent screen over here, okay? So it's going to ask you for the type of application. For this specific use case, I'm just going to say external. I'm going to let any user log into my account. I'm going to go ahead and click create. For the app name, I'm going to say like Webflow Xano OAuth. I can call it anything that I want here. It makes me put in a user support email, so I'll go ahead and put in my own. And I don't have to fill in app domain, but I do need the authorized domain. And the authorized domain is basically what domain is requesting this. And if you are using Webflow, well, you're going to put Webflow there. If you're using another service or another domain, that's the domain you would put there. Any domain that can request this access, you're giving that authorized access to. So I'm going to go ahead and, again, it's going to require an email here. Oh, that's right. You don't need the HTTPS. You can just say webflow.com, and then I'll go ahead and click save and continue. Okay. So now that I've gone ahead and done that, I actually only need to go to credentials. I don't need to do anything else here. I can just go to credentials. And for credentials, I'm going to basically create an OAuth 2.0 client ID, and I do that by clicking Create Credentials. So I'll go ahead and click that right now, and then I'll click OAuth Client ID. It's going to ask me for the application type, so I'll click Application Type. I'm going to say I'm building a web application, but you can obviously select what you specifically want. And then the only other thing that I'm going to need is this authorize redirect URI. So URI is like a URL, but this is basically saying, okay, as Google, once I authorize this user, where do you want me to send them, right? So we need basically a Webflow page for this. I'm going to do this later. I'm going to hit create for right now. And then it's going to give me a client ID and a client secret. You should definitely keep this private. I'm going to actually delete this after I do this demo, so it doesn't matter that you see this. But basically, this is what you enter into Xano, right? That's what it's asking for over here when you hit configure. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the client ID, and I'm going to go ahead and paste it here. And then I'm going to come back, and I'm going to copy this secret, and I'm going to paste it here. All right, so we have everything ready. I'm going to hit update. Okay, so in theory, this is ready to go. And before I move into the Webflow portion of it, it's just worth noting that if I go into my API, you can see that I have an API group, which is basically a collection of API endpoints called Google OAuth, right? That Xano installed when I went through that onboarding wizard. And there are 4 endpoints. There's continue, init, login, and sign up. So specifically what happens is when I go to continue with Google OAuth, there's always some sort of initialization endpoint that happens. And if you click on it, you can see that it's calling this function that goes through and does all the heavy lifting for you. But the important thing to note here is that this is what's called first, and then you can either log in or sign up the user, but we're going to use the continue API endpoint today because continue handles actually both login and sign up. It just says, you've probably seen in sites like continue with Facebook, continue with Twitter, and it will just do the right thing. So people don't have to sign up and then log in, right? It's just one step. So these are the 2 we will use today, and we'll come back to this. Okay, so now that this is done, let's go ahead and go to the Webflow setup. I'm going to click Webflow right over here, and I already have a project that I've started, and I'll go to the pages, and I'm going to just add a new area. And you can, however your Webflow page is set up, you can do this any way that you want, but I'm going to create a new folder called OAuth, okay? And I'll hit create. Okay, so now that OAuth is created, here it is down here, I'm going to go ahead and add 2 subpages. The first one is going to be called login, so I'll go ahead and hit create. And the second one, I will go ahead and say my account. Okay, great. And I'll hit create. All right, so now I have these 2 pages over here. So in the login page, what I want to do is I just really need one button. So I'll go ahead and put a container here. Then I'm going to go ahead and add an element. I'll add this button. And this button, I'm going to go ahead and center it in this container. Where are you? Okay, so this button, I'm going to say continue with Google. Okay, so now that I have that there, what I actually want to do is I want to go through and I want to change the ID here, right? Because I'm going to basically use JavaScript to call this button. But for right now, actually, what I want to do, I want to leave it as is, and I want to go through and I want to go to my account, this page specifically. So what I want to do here is I want to do just another container, and we'll do a couple things here. We'll go ahead and we will add a piece of text or a heading, right? And I'll just say, welcome to your account, right? This is going to be the logged in page. And then the next thing that I want to do, I want to add just like 2 more divs. And I'll add one here. And this is going to display, let's say this displays the email address of the person logged in. And then, and what I did was here, in the settings thing, I changed the ID to email, and we're going to leverage that later. And then I'll go ahead and add another div, and I will do full name, or just name is fine. Oops, let's just put it all within each other. There we go. And we'll do name, okay? So to be clear, I just said welcome, and I'll actually put these in the container. I'm never good at this, so you'll have to forgive me here. I'm gonna move this up there. There we go. Welcome to your account. And then this one, I wanna populate, I didn't know why that changed, with email, and this one I wanna populate with the name, okay? So again, if I go here, I have my, I've got my login screen, which is continue with Google, and I'll actually, let me do the ID now. This is just called auth button, right? I'm going to call this with JavaScript. When you click here, we're going to initiate that OAuth using that endpoint. Then what we're going to go ahead and do is, after you've initiated, you're going to go to my account. Here in my account, we're going to say welcome to your account, and we're going to display the email address and the name. And actually, let's do one more thing. Let's do a logout button, okay? And we'll just do that as a piece of text. Sorry, I'm definitely not a Webflow expert. I think it's just that. And I'll just say log out, okay? And then what we'll do is we'll call this log out. And then when someone clicks this, they'll be able to log out. Okay, so anyways, there's the logout text. We have everything that we need here in Webflow. Now let's go to the JavaScript and talk about what's happening. So just to be clear, if I didn't make this clear before, anytime you want to do any sort of web application type thing within Webflow, you just need JavaScript to make it work. So what I'm going to try to do is walk through this JavaScript just like I have with the other videos, tell you what's going on, and then give you a link so you can actually use it yourself. So the first, like lines 1 through 6, are basically variables that you define that are used later on in this JavaScript file, okay? The first is the login path, and this is the specific path that the user gets sent to if they are not authenticated. And that's a Webflow path. The redirect URI, remember we were talking about, is the same URL that the Google service was asking for that says, hey, look, once the user is actually authenticated, where do you want to send them? So the difference between the two, the login path is when they're not authenticated, where should they go to log in? And then the redirect URI is once they are logged in, where do we send them? And that is a full Webflow URL, okay? Line 3, this OAuth init URL is basically the initialization of the OAuth. So if we go back to Xano, it's this endpoint right here. Google OAuth, Google init, and that's what you take that endpoint from here. And then the continue URL is what happens when you want to go to Xano. And remember, we mentioned we're going to use the continue rather than the login and sign up because it handles both cases. Lines 5 and 6 are additional headers or response in the form that you can send along with the payload, but we're not going to use that today. It's just there in case you want to fill it out and send it in through the login response. So really these top 4 are the ones that we are going to use. So let's go ahead and fill this out right now. So first of all, I need the path to log in. And so if I go back to Webflow right over here, I can see that if I go to my page and I click here, I go to my settings, I can see the path is /OAuth, right? And then if I expand this and I look in that page, it's /OAuth/login. That's where I want to send users, okay? So that's what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to say /OAuth/login. Okay, great. So that's my login page. The redirect URI, where your Webflow users are redirected after the login, well, we're going to have to get the whole URL here. Why? Because Google needs to access it. So I can't do a relative path like I do here. I have to do the whole thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just publish this right now. And then what I'll do is I'll just take this whole URL, which is WMX0CXE, whatever, webflow.io. So let's go ahead and do that. This is where I want, but I actually don't want the login screen. Let's go ahead and go to the account screen. So I'm going to close this. I'm going to click on the My Account screen over here, and then I'll click that. this is the screen that I want to send people to. So I'm going to update this now here in this code, right? So this is going to be over here. And now that I have this, I can actually also update it in the credentials. So remember, if I click this pencil button on OAuth Web Client ID, this is what I just created, I'm going to go to this authorize redirect URI. That's why we're saying Google, it's okay to send people here, right? So I'm going to go ahead and hit save. So now Google has permission to send people there after they're logged in. So let's go back here. So that's done. The init URL, we go to Xano and we copy the initialization URL. And I'll paste it here. And then finally, the continue URL, because that handles both cases, is right over here. Okay, great. We have everything that we need. So let me actually try to just very quickly take you through the JavaScript. Feel free to skip this if you don't care, but I think it's always just important to kind of know what's going on. So this function over here is initialize OAuth. This is the function that calls the Xano backend that then communicates with Google and logs someone in. So it's basically going through, it's looking for the URL for this init, right? So remember, that's basically what URL it's calling. It's then, after it's logged in, it's basically taking that redirect URI and it's sending people there after they're logged in. So fetch is just a way to basically get an API call. And if it's successful, it's storing everything in this RES. And RES is like results or response, right? And then it's formatting it in JSON. So this is the important part, RES, because if everything happens correctly, it's stored in that variable, and you'll see us mention it, access it a couple times. So how do you actually initialize this init OAuth function? Well, you do a button, right? This button is called auth button on the page. So remember, in Webflow, if I go to the page login over here, you can see that there's a continue with Google button, and I did that ID as auth button, okay? So if I click back over here, you can see that it's this document.querySelector is looking for an element on the page or an ID on the page called auth button. If that button is clicked, then it's going to init OAuth, which is it initialize this whole thing over here, okay? Then there's a logout button, right? And that logout button initializes the logout function, which is further down the page, okay? And that logout button is on this page over here on my account. So it's logout. Okay, great. So now that that's done, let me go a little bit further. Okay, so on page load, because this JavaScript handles a number of different use cases, what we're saying is always check to see if there's a code in the URL parameter. So what is the code? It's that limited access token that comes from the OAuth service. So in Google, once I give it permission to log in, it sends that code or a limited access token along, and we get it from the URL, right? So it basically appends to the URL, and we basically capture it and authenticate the user that way, and then we go into the My Account page. And it's actually not My Account, so actually, what are we calling it right now? We are calling it, I see we just want to make sure we have the right page. It's just called My Account without the dash. So anywhere you see this, you can update it. So My Account is what the page is called, okay? So it's good that we're going through this JavaScript. And then so this function right over here is continue with the OAuth. This basically takes that code from the URL that I just mentioned above, and it then deletes it in the URL. So for good hygiene and for security, we don't want it always to be persistent, that code. We want to remove it from that URL bar, and that's what these lines are doing. What else is important here? So this is basically this save token. We're saying that this specific function takes the authenticated user and it stores it in local storage. So how do we know, for example, after a user logs in with Google that they're logged in for a long time and they can access restricted pages? This is how we store their authentication in local storage using that RES. Remember, RES, response? We basically store everything in that response in local storage. Then this basically update the auth state. Like every time there's an update, we pop an alert, which you can easily remove, right? You can just get rid of it if you don't want to see a pop-up every time you sign in. But this basically says response.name. That's going to say the name of the person logging in just for debugging purposes, right? Then what we're going to do is we're going to update the element on the page. If we find ID called name, we're going to update it with the person's name. And if we find an ID with email, we're going to update the person's email. So if we go to this Webflow over here on the My Account page, remember, we have two divs, email and name, okay? So that's what it's going to populate, response.name and response.email. Okay. And then right over here, we're populating this inner HTML with this function over here. And then when you log out specifically using this button right over here, what we're going to do is we're actually getting rid of the local storage, that authorization token, and then we're reloading the window, okay? So I know that's high level. If you've never worked with JavaScript before, it may be complex, but I thought it was helpful to go through. JavaScript is really just a series of functions and ways to execute on the function, right? So in it, OAuth, for example, that's a function. It doesn't do anything in itself, but this button, right, is an event listener. On click, it fires this function off, right? So that's just kind of any JavaScript file typically is defined this way. So now with all of that there, and remember, we changed that from my dash account to my account because that's what I have it on the page. I think we're ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this whole thing right over here, and I'm going to actually put it in the login page at the bottom. And I want to make sure that it's between script tags because we're telling Webflow we're using JavaScript, right? I'll go ahead and paste it there. That looks good. And then I'm going to do the same thing with my account. I click on the gear icon, I go down to the bottom, and I use the script tag. Okay, and then that's done. Now, you definitely could add this to the project JavaScript settings. There's other things you need to do. To keep this demo very simple, I'm just going to put it on every page that I want to log in and have the user have access to, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and publish it on this side. Okay, so now that this is published, and I'll go to that page in a second, let me just go ahead and recap what we've done over here. We have installed the Google OAuth service here in Xano. We've added a project in Google Cloud, and we've gotten the client ID and the client secret, and we've updated that. We've then used these two endpoints in this JavaScript, right? And we've configured Webflow, and we've added two simple pages. One where the user can continue with Google and log in, right? And the other is if they're logged in, it basically goes to their account. All of this information is stored in local storage, and then when you log out, it clears it. All right, so if I've done everything right, then this should just work. So fingers crossed. So I'm going to go to login right now, and I'm going to go to, I already published it a few seconds ago, so let's just go ahead and check it out. So it says, hi, Prakash Chandran. That's because I was testing before, and it's already me logged in. And just so you can actually see in local storage, I'm going to hit inspect. I'll click on application. You can see this auth is here, right? I can actually just get rid of this. Like I can just delete this right here. And so now I'm not going to be logged in. So if I log in again, you see how it doesn't pop hi Prakash Chandran? That's where local storage is stored. So let's go ahead and click continue with Google and see what happens. So I'm right now my Prakash@Xano account. That's the one I'm auth with Google. So I'm going to click continue with Google. Now you're going to see that it's saying, okay, you want to what account you want to continue with. So it's any Google account that you want. I could always click use another account. I'm going to go ahead and say prakash@google.com. It says hi Prakash Chandran. This says okay. And when I say okay, you can see that the email is populated and my name is populated here. Okay. So I'm going to copy this right over here, and I'll show you something. So right now I'm logged in. I can access this page. But I'm going to go ahead and log out. And remember, it now takes me to that login page. Now, if I enter this again, my account, notice how it kicks me back over here because we're not detecting that authentication token in local storage. Again, so I'll show you again. It kicked me back here. I can only access it through continuing with Google. And now I'm here. So any page the JavaScript is on, it's going to basically check for that local storage token, and then you can log out directly over here. Okay, so hopefully this was a good primer into how OAuth works, what it is, how you set it up in Xano, and how you then get it working in Webflow. Feel free to leave comments below if you have any questions at all. We're trying to do more videos like this where it's like one part educational and then walking you through everything. There's more links below with how you can do things with Webflow and Xano. And we will also include this code so you can just copy and paste it and just fill out the variables above. So again, thank you again for watching, and we will see you in the next video.